These are the 5 league-winning wide receivers that you need in fantasy football for 2023, starting with Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, man. So Garrett Wilson, to me, is flat out one of the biggest slam dunks in all of fantasy football in 2023. To start this off with, Garrett Wilson is one of the best wide receiver prospects that I have scouted personally since 2018. I can look back at guys like Calvin Ridley, guys like Jamar Chase. Those two guys I think of as better prospects than Garrett Wilson coming out of college. But other than those two guys, there really isn't anyone who was that good of a prospect. Justin Jefferson wasn't even the same level of prospect that Garrett Wilson was coming out of college. I love Garrett Wilson as a wide receiver, and what he did last year was simply incredible when you factor in everything. As you can see on the screen here, those numbers aren't true wide receiver 1 in fantasy football type numbers. They're not top 5 numbers. But what you have to understand is this guy was a 21-year-old rookie when he did this. And not only that, he did this with a combination of Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, and Mike White at quarterback. This is unbelievable stuff right here that Garrett Wilson was able to pull off. With that type of horrific quarterback situation, what he was able to do in 2022 in his rookie season is just outstanding to me. Now he gets Aaron Rodgers, future first ballot Hall of Fame Aaron Rodgers of the formerly Green Bay Packers, comes over to this offense, looks revitalized in camp, looks totally rejuvenated to be out there, and is getting along and building relationships with the younger players, which is a knock that he had for many, many years with the Green Bay Packers. Also gave up a bunch of his salary, probably to help get Dalvin Cook, who is now on the team, but that's beside the point. The point is why this is going to be such a great year for Aaron Rodgers. When you look at last year, it wasn't good. It was probably one of his worst seasons of his career. Statistically, it definitely was not good. What's also important to note here, in that last season for Aaron Rodgers, it was his first season out of all of his seasons in his career without a true number 1 wide receiver. Now, Christian Watson developed into a true number 1 later on in the year, but he was a rookie last year as well, and it took him time to be able to get up to speed. So Aaron Rodgers dealt with most of the season without a true number 1. Now he's got Garrett Wilson, a true number 1 wide receiver. So let me ask you this really quick. Do we acknowledge that Garrett Wilson is a great player? I truly want to know. Please let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on Garrett Wilson. Is he too overhyped or is he properly hyped? Because I believe most of us would say Garrett Wilson is a great player. And this is important because when you look back at the last 3 years that Davante Adams spent with Aaron Rodgers, Davante Adams was given at or around a 30% target share in that offense. That shows us a couple of things. Obviously, we know Davante Adams is a great player, but it also shows us that Aaron Rodgers loves to target a wide receiver 1 ad nauseum. Ad nauseum. Aaron Rodgers loves to do this. That's why Garrett Wilson is going to be the one who benefits. He is the true number 1 wide receiver on this team. It's not close. The talent gap between him and Allen Lazard at wide receiver 2 is massive. It's totally massive. And his wide receiver 9 price on Underdog and wide receiver 10 price on ESPN may sound like they're actually a little bit of a reach. He is my wide receiver 6 in half PPR and full PPR for the upcoming 2023 fantasy football season. Do not be surprised if Garrett Wilson is a top 5 wide receiver by the end of 2023. Now moving on to number 2, I've got Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos here on this list. Now here's the thing about Jerry Jeudy. I've gotten actually really high on Jerry Jeudy, specifically over the past month. And I'll be honest here, Tim Patrick and the KJ Hamler injuries, they definitely have helped. They have definitely helped raise him above. But really the biggest reason, and it's almost embarrassing to say as a fantasy football analyst, I've been ignoring Jerry Jeudy for far too long. And what I mean by that is last year, if you have been a viewer of this channel since 2022, first of all, I appreciate your support. But second of all, you may remember my most embarrassing take of 2022 being that Courtland Sutton was going to be a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy and better than Jerry Jeudy. Obviously, that was a horrific prediction in fantasy football, and I got that so wrong. And every time I talk about Jerry Jeudy, I feel the need to bring this up because it illustrates how far I have come with Jerry Jeudy. Because when you look back at 2022, when you study him with a closer eye, you can see that he was the best wide receiver on this team. Now, when you look at target totals on the Denver Broncos last year, Courtland Sutton had more targets. But Jerry Jeudy was way more efficient with his targets last year with Russell Wilson. It wasn't even close. And this is something that I find really important. Even though it is a very small sample size, I will let you guys know this up front. He was the wide receiver 2 in half PPR from weeks 14 through 18. Now, what also happened during that time period? They also fired Nathaniel Hackett off of this team. So they had no more Nathaniel Hackett screwing things up. And Jerry Jeudy was the wide receiver 2 in those last couple of weeks. It's not a big enough sample size to say, well, yeah, that absolutely is exactly what happened. But again, I mean, do you think it's a coincidence or not? I think this actually has something really big to do with it. So first of all, we know we can go on a run, and there's no way that this offense is worse in 2023 than it was in 2022. Sean Payton is going to help Russell Wilson, which in turn is going to help Jerry Jeudy for this season. He is the wide receiver 20 on Underdog and the wide receiver 19 on ESPN. I am buying Jerry Jeudy actively in fantasy football drafts right now. Now, moving on to number 3, I've got George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers on this list. Now, let me be honest with you guys about George Pickens really quick. I think we need to get this out in front. George Pickens, I don't believe, is going to be the main target in Pittsburgh this year. I will say that right now. If you watched week 1 of the preseason, when Kenny Pickett, Deontay Johnson, and George Pickens all played together, George Pickens was still the second target, and Deontay Johnson was still dominating the target share in this offense. So you may be asking, Ryan, why is George Pickens on your list? There are 2 main reasons why he is on this list, and let me tell you why. So first of all, when we look at George Pickens' player profile, he is a big play wide receiver. Obviously, we've all seen great highlights of George Pickens dating back to college, catching ridiculous balls. He is a highlight reel type of player, and he is a big, boom, explosive play type of guy. When you look at 2022, not very impressive stats at all from a fantasy football perspective. Wide receiver 37 finish, 8.3 fantasy points per game. Not very good. But what is very interesting here, and I think the saving grace here for George Pickens, is when you see what he did with Kenny Pickett. Keep in mind, fellow rookie last year, rookie first-round quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had a 97.6 quarterback rating when he was targeting George Pickens. That is the saving grace here, because what that shows you is that he preferred to go to George Pickens because George Pickens and him worked really well together. That's the reality of Pittsburgh, and what they dealt with last year was that George Pickens was the best wide receiver on this team. So we have to take that for what it is, and also we need to factor in that both of these guys are going into year 2. So we need to factor in natural second-year progression for both George Pickens and Kenny Pickett. And the last reason why he is on this list is because of his price. He is the wide receiver 37 on Underdog. Keep that in mind. Wide receiver 30 on ESPN. When we look at it from Underdog, remember what his finish was last year. He was the wide receiver 37 last year. So what this draft price tells us is that people actually expect George Pickens to remain exactly the same from a fantasy finish perspective in 2023. That's not going to happen. He is absolutely going to leap up this year. To me, George Pickens is a clear candidate to jump 10 to 15 spots in his fantasy finish. Our next guy on the list is Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, man. Now, I think one thing that most of us acknowledge with Chris Olave is that he is a very, very good player. I think most of us acknowledge that at this point. When you look at last year, what he did on the screen, it's actually very comparable to Garrett Wilson and what his situation was in New York. Because when you look at Garrett Wilson, like we talked about earlier, he had a ridiculous clown show at quarterback. Well, Chris Olave had a very similar situation. he had Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton. And sometimes Taysom Hill mixed in. You know how that goes every season. But the point is that Chris Olave had no steady quarterback one in this offense. So what he did last year with the guys that he had is very, very impressive. Now, what I said earlier about, I think most of us acknowledge that he's a very good player. What's interesting to me is when you look at the price of Chris Olave. So this may or may not sound weird to you at all. And let me know in the comments if it does or not. He's the wide receiver 12 on Underdog and the wide receiver 15 on ESPN. Now, what's important to note about that ESPN price is that he is going in the 4th round of ESPN drafts right now. That to me is simply crazy. And I want to try to relate to people who are concerned about Chris Olave and maybe why they don't have him as a wide receiver 12, a top 12 wide receiver this year. I want to try to relate to the people out there who do think that. So what is the main concern here? The main concern is Derek Carr, obviously. Derek Carr is not a well-liked quarterback in the NFL. I like Derek Carr more than consensus do, actually. I think when you look closer at Derek Carr, and we will in just a minute here, you can see that Derek Carr supports good fantasy wide receivers. If you didn't see Derek Carr in the preseason opener, he was really, really sharp in his preseason opener. Granted, it's preseason, guys. It is preseason. Nothing is set in stone, and definitely do not take anything super, super highly thought of when it comes to preseason football. But most importantly, I think are two things. Most importantly is that number one, Derek Carr has supported 3 top 12 wide receivers in fantasy football throughout his career. Davante Adams last year as a top 3 wide receiver, Amari Cooper as a top 12 wide receiver, and Hunter Renfrow as a top 12 wide receiver. Now, the second most important thing here with Derek Carr is that he actually has a really good deep ball. And that deep ball that he had led him to connect with Davante Adams on 14 touchdowns in 2022. Now, when you connect that with Chris Olave had 29 deep targets last year, which was good for 4th overall, and he had a 14.0 average depth of target in 2022. So a big part of Chris Olave's game is the deep ball. He is a big play threat, and Olave is now the clear wide receiver 1 in New Orleans. There's no doubt about that. So if you're getting him in the 4th round of ESPN, this is simply a no-brainer to me. This guy has easy top 5 upside in fantasy football. Now moving on to number 5 here, it is Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. So I'm going to attempt to make this the last time that I shout at y'all about Jackson Smith-Njigba, but I cannot promise that. I will not promise that to you guys. I have called him several things this offseason. I have called him a must-draft player. I have called him a breakout player. But if nothing else, what I want you guys to remember above all else is that he has league-winning upside in 2023. If you are unfamiliar with Jackson Smith-Njigba is a first-round wide receiver out of Ohio State for the Seattle Seahawks. Now, what we need to do is put it into context what he did in Ohio State. So in his true sophomore season, he had a wide receiver room that was absolutely historic. We haven't seen a wide receiver room quite like this. This wide receiver room contained a junior year Garrett Wilson, a senior year Chris Olave, Jackson Smith-Njigba, a freshman year Marvin Harrison Jr., and a freshman year Emeka Egbuka. And amongst all of those guys, Jackson Smith-Njigba was the one you could not take your eyes off of. He was absolutely brilliant in his sophomore season. So what ends up happening here? What ends up happening here is that his junior season in 2022, he ended up missing most of that, and it was really wiped away largely due to a hamstring injury. But let me ask you this question, and I've asked this question a couple of times over the past couple of weeks of videos. If he came out of college and into the NFL draft after that sophomore season where he was ridiculously great, do you think he would have been a top 20 pick, which is where he went in 2023? Or do you think he would have been a top 10 pick? Genuinely curious, please let me know in the comments. Because to me, he would have been a top 10 pick in the NFL draft this year, and this would have led him to being viewed so much differently than he is right now. Because right now, the way he's being viewed is as a wide receiver 3 behind DK and Tyler Lockett. If he was a top 10 pick this year, he would immediately be viewed as at least the wide receiver 2 in this offense. But the reality here with Jackson Smith-Njigba is he is one of the best wide receiver prospects I have scouted in many, many years. He's a pro-ready rookie. His preseason opener was really, really good. And DK Metcalf is leading the charge amongst his teammates of the praise that Jackson Smith-Njigba is getting in Seattle right now. Now, I'm not even going to do this. I'm not even going to go as far as to say that he's going to be better than Jackson Smith-Njigba. I believe he will. But I think it's reasonable enough to say that he will definitely be better than Tyler Lockett right off the bat. And his upside specifically will emerge in the second half of the season. And he is the wide receiver 30 in Underdog right now and the wide receiver 38 on ESPN. You have to take a shot here on a guy with top 12 upside. And if you want to see who the must-draft running backs in 2023 fantasy football are, click on this video right here.